Red eyes. Have you been in the forest yet? The older woman sitting next to me asked. Maite and I sat on a log at a large fire pit at the campground. This was our first visit to this busy family campground in Seabury, MA. Seabury was a blink and you'll miss it town by the Quabbin Reservoir in central Massachusetts. This was the last weekend of the season, everyone else had spent most of the summer together. Multiple people had come by and invited us to join the community campfire, as soon as we had stepped out of our camper earlier that day. Everyone had brought their dinners, and now that it was dark, we were making s'mores and telling stories. I shook my head and blew out the fiery inferno that was my marshmallow. The black char smelled like caramelized sugar. This was the first time since we had gotten into the camper before dawn that Maite wasn't complaining about my surprise long weekend trip. Her list of grievances including waking up before the sun rose, the length of time we had to wait food at Dunkin's, the shitty roads that were full of potholes, and the number of people who had needed to come into our camper and explore. Now she was sipping from a mug filled with spiked hot chocolate, still pouting, but at least she seemed to be enjoying herself. What's wrong with the forest? I asked as I laid the blackened marshmallow on the piece of chocolate and graham cracker. The woman leaned close like she was telling me a secret. I'm only warning you because nobody else will think to do it. We all know it's off limits, but your spot is closer than anyone else's camps, the woman said. I hadn't caught this woman's name, but I didn't know anyone else's either. Maite and I only came over because she needed to get out from the small camper we were using for the weekend. I worried this weekend might be the doom of our relationship. Why is it off limits? I asked before taking a bite of my s'more. The woman slowly turned her marshmallow, patiently letting it brown on all sides. It's haunted, and people get hurt when they go in. We don't need a lawsuit, so we just keep it off limits, she said in a loud whisper. Don't listen to her, a man said as he came out of the darkness. It's a small wooded area with a nice little creek where you can go fishing. The log shifted as Maite turned to hear more. She loved fishing, having the patience to sit for hours with a book and wait for something good to bite. I had assumed her love of fishing would mean she liked camping. I had been wrong, and even getting a camper to make the weekend more comfortable had been a miscalculation. We brought our fishing gear, I said after I swallowed. That's what we want to do tomorrow. The man nodded, and, since there was a new moon tonight, I could just see from the firelight the woman rolling her eyes. You'll be fine if you stay on the path, he said. The stories are just local myths. I've never had a problem. The stories are more than local myths, John, she said and slapped her leg. The stories go back to the colonial era and probably longer than that. This has remained undeveloped for a reason. I looked back and forth between John and the woman. How's it haunted? Tell her, Marcia. It's your theory, John said and walked away with a huff. The whole region is a little spooky, but I hear things at night, Marcia said, leaning in again. I hear creaking and moaning from the forest all the time. There are trees, when you get deeper, that have these blood-red knots in the middle of their trunks. My eyes got wide. So, you've been in then? Maite asked, slurring her words a little. My girlfriend had turned toward us. For someone who hated camping, she enjoyed the key elements of a camping trip. Her love of horror books and movies made her the perfect mark for a mysterious local folktale. Just once, Marcia added. When we first started camping here. They scared the bejesus out of me, and I won't go back in. I had been told there was a hot spring near the creek that was nice too, you know. Marcia winked, and Maite coughed. Something about this old woman talking about skinny dipping and sex made me want to giggle. I've heard the stories too, someone else said from the other side of the fire pit, but I couldn't see who. There are records from the colonists who first settled here, and the trees spooked them. Even the natives avoided the spot. Have you been in? Marcia asked. There is a long pause on the other end. No, the voice finally said. I wouldn't dare go back there. I've lived in the Bridgewater area long enough to know weird stuff happens here all the time. It's because the Native Americans cursed the settlers. John came back towards us from the opposite direction. The whole area is cursed, but if you're lucky, you'll see some amazing things like thunderbirds. And mutilated animals, another man said with a deep chuckle. The devil worshippers in the 1980s used to come into the forest and sacrifice people. Who knows how many disappeared? An entire town disappeared once, John said. It's under the reservoir. There are a bunch of towns like that, Marcia said. That was planned even if they didn't tear down all the buildings. There's Dunwich, John said. Even I had heard about that town. In the past 5 years, it had become a ghost town, people disappearing or moving away in fear. That's not in the Bridgewater Triangle, Marcia waved her hand dismissing John's comment. That's too far north. Both Maite and I were transfixed by this conversation. I wondered how often this group had this argument, it felt rehearsed. Maybe I could convince Maite to join me in the forest tomorrow. Hopefully, the fishing spot and hot spring were on the trail. I found a book in the library that said the trees have always been there, a teenage boy on the log next to Maite said. They're a line of birch trees or something. Nobody cuts them down. I met Maite's eyes, convincing her wouldn't require any effort. I woke up alone the following day. I could smell bacon cooking on the tiny stove on the other side of the flimsy partition. I had crashed when we got back to the camper and slept through the night, something I rarely did, even at home. Maite was up first and was whistling instead of picking another fight with me. She had done that repeatedly since I announced this trip a few weeks before. I hoped this peace would last for the rest of the trip, and we could have a fun day. Want to find the fishing spot? I asked her as we ate. She didn't meet my eye as she scribbled in her daily journal. We should try to find those weird trees, she said with a nod. I wasn't excited about the idea of finding some creepy trees, but I was willing to do anything to make her happy. Maite wrote everything in her journal, including questions she wanted to answer. She considered it a reflection of her mind, and if she was interested in a unique experience that she could research later, then I would accommodate that. This entire adventure had started with the worst fight of our relationship. I'd wanted to go camping for our fall vacation, but she'd wanted something more comfortable. I'd thought buying a camper would be a compromise and found a classic silver bullet online. It was used and had needed some fixing, but it'd be perfect for our first camping trip as a couple. I'd been pleased with myself until I'd seen the look on Maite's face. She'd said when she saw me pull into her driveway, my truck pulling the trailer behind it. What the hell is this? She was cute when she was confused. Her nose would scrunch up, her head tilted to the side as she blinked rapidly. Unable to keep from smiling, I'd kissed her on the nose once I was out of the truck and standing beside her. I solved the problem. I'd said, turning to face the sleek camper. What problem would that be, Carmen? Maite had asked. I hated to think about the fight a week before. I had suggested a romantic camping trip in the woods to celebrate our first anniversary, fantasizing about it for weeks. A brochure for the campground had come in the mail earlier in the summer and I had been thinking about it for weeks. There had been a special price for the weekend. I had all the equipment. I had loved camping all my life, often going before I met Maite. I knew she liked fishing, and I'd found a campground close to a river. She'd seemed as disgusted by the trailer as she had been when I'd suggested we sleep in a tent on an air mattress. I'm a hotel and spa girl, she'd said as she walked around the camper, repeating what she had told me when I had proposed the camping trip. I want someone to clean up my room and room service to bring me meals. I want to get a massage and swim in a warm pool. I don't camp. Last week, I'd picked that moment to argue, and the entire conversation had descended into a fight about forcing my preferences on her. This time, I had questioned and regretted my plan. I had already booked everything and couldn't get a refund since this had been a special price. Look, I know you said you don't want to sleep on the ground. I get it. This way, we're sleeping in a bed. I already bought the pass to camp on the site, and it's got this amazing brook where you can fish, swim, and relax. I'd said, taking in her hands and squeezing them. Maite had pulled one hand away from me so she could rub it over her face. She'd sighed, and I could practically see her brain working on how to respond. You owe me a luxury spa trip for this. In the next 3 months. Going into the woods was clearly off limits. Not only did the campground's welcome brochure explain that, but there was a chain-link fence blocking the way. The fence was also cut open. Clearly, people went in all the time, and I wasn't going to let a silly rule keep me from salvaging this trip. I watched Maite pack for the day. Autumn had arrived, even though the weather forecast had promised warmth all weekend. It was overcast and damp, which made it feel colder than it was. Maite knew what she needed for fishing. I wasn't interested in it myself, but I had a book and blanket, so I could relax with her. I made sure we had food and plenty of water. I even packed a towel in case we found a hot spring to swim in. We stuck to the path as we walked, and it wasn't long before we found a spot Maite liked. She set up her fishing equipment while I laid out the blanket and snacks. She was silent as she cast her line and waited for a bite as she put the bait on my hook and handed it to me. The tension between us faded some as we listened to the rustling of the leaves and the creaking as the trees moved when the wind blew. I could hear the crashing of water as it broke over a small waterfall some distance away. We got comfortable and read our books, waiting for something to bite. We said nothing as we enjoyed the sounds of the world around us. Our spot was in a clearing, so when the sun suddenly appeared, the blonde highlights in Maite's brown hair shined. Watching her relax helped ease the anxiety I hadn't realized I was carrying too. Let's go find the hot spring, I said after a few hours, closing my book. Nothing had bitten, so Maite pulled her line in with a frown before peering into the water. She could have waited longer, but that didn't seem to be why she was unhappy. There aren't any fish in this stream. That's weird, she said without looking up from the water. Maybe because it's so late in the season? I suggested, not sure if that was a real reason. I had no idea how fishing worked. The spring was a completely disconnected body of water, a little larger than the above-ground pool at my parents' house. Maite was the one who found it and dipped her hand in before I got to the spot. It was in a dense cluster of trees. Maite smiled at me and started removing her clothes as I looked at the trees. Their leaves were already turning red, but they didn't have the bloody knots that Marcia and John had talked about the night before. I dropped our things and followed her example, ready to finally enjoy this camping trip with the woman I loved. Come in, Carmen, Maite said after jumping in, her long dark hair pooling around her. It's like a hot tub in winter. I got close to the edge. There were rocks around it, almost deliberately there to lure people in. I tossed my underwear and bra away as I peered over the edge. It looked deeper than I expected, the water dark as if there was no bottom. Unlike Maite, I sat down on a rock and slid in. There was no place to stand, let alone sit. We swam around in different directions before finding a solid spot for our feet. Maite giggled as she pulled me closer, and I felt her hands brush over my body. I leaned in and kissed her as she pinned me between her warm body and the muddy wall of the spring. Our hands roamed each other's bodies, and I wished for a less precarious position. Maite pulled away from me, her eyes wide. Did that tree just blink? I turned, grabbing hold of the rock edge so I could see better. Her body pressed against me, shaking. The tree facing us was like the others, but also had a knot facing us. I understood why the others had described them as bloody. The bright red sap dripped from the corner of the large, round knot in the center. Their roots were even covered by the old, maroon sap that had been dripping for years. I'm sure it was your imagination, I said, trying to hide my fear. I had checked these trees. I would have noticed if one had that knot. Then we heard a rustle in the forest, and that was all it took. I grabbed Maite's hand underwater and looked our clothes. We were on the opposite end of the spring, but I could see the pile of our things. I want to go home, Maite whispered. I could hear her teeth clattering and realized the temperature in the water had changed. It took me a moment, but I realized the creaking of the trees had abruptly stopped. Get out. I pulled myself out of the water and then helped her out. It took all my strength to lift her. The last thing I wanted to do was swim back to our clothes. I want to go home, Maite said again, her voice now a sharp whine. I was surprised I could hear her over all the different sounds that started coming from the forest. The creating had started again, and now I heard snapping and rustling as if the trees were attacking each other. I walked through the maze of trees that hadn't seemed to be there before, but I wasn't getting closer to our stuff. I could still see the pile, but we seemed to be getting farther away. Are the trees moving? I stopped and looked for a better path around the spring. Maite didn't respond. Something thudded behind me. I turned, expecting to see Maite when I heard a sharp scream. She was several feet behind me, on her hands and knees at the base of two trees. Ruddy dirt splattered all over her naked body. Carmen, I need help, she cried. Her foot was caught under a root. As I headed to help her, the blood-red knot on a tree opened. Like an eye. I stumbled and fell back. I tried to crawl away, but Maite grabbed my ankle. Carmen, I can't get my foot free. Tears streamed down her face. I swear, the knot looked down at her, blinked, and then turned back at me. I got back up and tried to pull her foot free. I can't get it free, baby. I had to shout over the moaning, rasping wood. Maite just cried. The root tightens around her foot. I didn't know what to do. There was probably a small knife with our stuff, but we were nude in the dark forest. I wanted to cry too. If the knot was like an eye, then I might be able to hurt it and get it to free Maite. I climbed past her, over the roots, and pulled my fist back. The crack of bone seared up my arm upon impact. It wasn't soft tissue like a human eye, no matter what it appeared to be. Pain screaming from my hand made me swoon. Then a crunch from my foot nearly doubled me over, tree roots crushed up to my ankle. The world spun around me and I lost focus for a moment. I darted my head around, when I could see again, looking for Maite. Roots held both her hands, and she was deep enough for them to stretch over her back as she sunk deeper into the ground. I could no longer see her hands and feet as the roots pushed her down. Carmen. She mouthed through her tears, repeating my name over and over. I couldn't hear her over the noise of the trees. I tried to get to her, but I was being pulled farther away from her, the roots dragging my feet. My face slammed into a thick root and my vision blurred. Whichever tree held me, it wasn't the same one that had captured her. This one was pulling me away, making it impossible for me to help. I tried to grab onto another root as I was pulled farther away. My hand slipped and my fingernails bent back. I cried out as the bones in my feet snapped like twigs, the pain so intense I could barely see. I could make out Maite as she was pushed into the earth, not even able to see me, but that was for the best, because I too was descending, the roots grabbing my waist and pulling me deeper. My vision cleared for a moment and I saw all the trees around me, red knots blinking in random order. Nothing helped as I was encased in the roots. They squeezed me and I thought I was going to pop like a balloon. I could still hear Maite crying even though she was gone. It was like an echo in my head. The last thing I saw was the blood-red knot look down at me and blink. I was sure the tree was smiling.